The meeting between the leaders of China and the United States is to seek the normalization of relations between the two countries and also to exchange views on questions.
In 1967, Richard Nixon published an article in Foreign Affairs titled Asia After Vietnam. In it, he wrote, "We simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations." The message was subtle but clear. Isolating China wasn't sustainable. Nixon saw an opportunity, a way to open a wedge between China and the Soviet Union and shift the balance of the Cold War. When Nixon became president, he chose Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor. Kissinger was the architect of Realpolitik, a strategy rooted not in ideology, but in power and survival. In July 1971, Kissinger secretly flew to Beijing through Pakistan. There, he met with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai and laid the groundwork for a historic realignment. In February 1972, Nixon stood face-to-face with Chairman Mao Zedong in Beijing. It was a geopolitical shockwave, the leader of global capitalism meeting the high priest of communist revolution. The strategy behind it was clear. Open their markets, encourage trade, allow Western capital in, and China would gradually transform. Wealth would lead to rights. Capitalism would create democracy. This was the bet, that free markets could change China from the inside. For decades, the West believed that engaging China would lead to cooperation. In recent years, however, evidence has begun to cast doubt on the success of this strategy. A leaked internal speech attributed to General Chi Haotian, China's former Minister of Defense, laid out a chilling doctrine. The speech was published by analyst J.R. Nyquist and included lines such as, "We must prepare ourselves for two scenarios. If our biological weapons succeed in the surprise attack, the Chinese people will be able to survive. Only countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia have the vast land to serve our need for mass colonization." At the same time, Chinese military doctrine was evolving. In 1999, two PLA colonels published Unrestricted Warfare, a book detailing how China could defeat stronger adversaries without ever firing a shot. Economic warfare, cyber attacks, media infiltration, legal manipulation, all were considered valid tools of war. The first rule of unrestricted warfare is that there are no rules. Once seen as a future ally, China is now understood by many as the most sophisticated asymmetric threat the West has ever faced, and the West helped build it. In recent years, prominent investors and financial leaders have begun voicing serious concerns about China's economic trajectory.
Rather than letting private enterprise blossom, Xi Jinping introduced his own China dream that can be summed up in two words: total control.
The issue is no longer ideological. It's practical and it's financial. Larry Fink has advised Western companies to reassess their ties to China, suggesting that it's time to rethink relationships with the Chinese Communist Party and its investment opportunities. A report by the Atlantic Council has outlined how China's use of economic coercion and opaque regulation presents long-term strategic risks for international investors. This shift in tone reflects a broader trend across Wall Street. What was once seen as the golden market of the future is now being approached with caution. China didn't stop at building internal power. With capital in hand, it expanded outward, forging alliances with governments sympathetic to its model of centralized control. In Latin America, it has provided billions in credit to countries like Venezuela and Ecuador, securing political loyalty through infrastructure and resource agreements. In Brazil, under President Lula da Silva, a multi-billion-dollar currency swap deal reduced dependency on the US dollar and tightened bilateral ties. These are not isolated transactions. They are part of a long-term strategy. One by one, China is turning economic deals into geopolitical footholds. And this doesn't even begin to cover the rivers of money flowing into American media, think tanks, and political circles, all meant to shift public perception from the inside. In her book American Betrayal, journalist Diana West argues that foreign ideological infiltration has long undermined U.S. institutions from within, and today, China continues that legacy through subtler, better-funded means. One example is the 1996 campaign finance scandal, where Chinese agents attempted to funnel illegal donations into US political campaigns to influence policy. More concerning is the work of China's United Front Work Department, an agency tasked with shaping foreign opinion and controlling diaspora narratives. Just as the fall of the Berlin Wall did not mark the end of communism, but instead allowed it to evolve through the resurgence of KGB-linked networks, China's rise represents a new form of ideological warfare dressed in capital and trade. So not only is China growing stronger, it's doing so with American money. Better late than never, a shift has begun, and it's not being led by presidents or press conferences, but by BlackRock, Blackstone, and others quietly repositioning their capital under the shadow of a broader strategic realignment. From private equity to ETFs, the withdrawal has already begun, not with headlines, but with silent exclusions, amended prospectuses, and declining Chinese exposure across the board. This wasn't a Trump doctrine. In fact, it continued and quietly accelerated under President Biden. His administration imposed some of the most aggressive measures against China in decades, sweeping export bans on advanced semiconductors, blacklisting hundreds of Chinese companies, and signing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to choke off imports from Xinjiang. In 2024, Biden signed an executive order restricting outbound US investment in Chinese AI, quantum computing, and chip industries. And through the CHIPS and Science Act, the White House pledged $52 billion to bring semiconductor production back to American soil, a direct strike at Beijing's ambitions for technological self-sufficiency. Actions once seen as extreme became bipartisan orthodoxy, freezing investments, banning exports, cutting off key technologies. The decoupling is no longer theory. Chinese equities and ETFs have been in free fall for months. Capital is fleeing, and the markets know what Washington hasn't said out loud. Even as tensions with China have cooled since the height of the trade war, the message from Washington remains clear. The age of economic dependence on China is over. Quietly but decisively, US companies and capital are moving out, and the new map doesn't lead back to Beijing. India has become one of several rising alternatives. With its expanding industrial capacity and geopolitical alignment, it's drawing major investments from American firms. Apple, among others, is ramping up production there, not just for market access, but to escape Chinese leverage. Beyond shifting supply chains, the US is building economic coalitions designed to surround China. Through initiatives like the Quad and the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, America is working with Japan, Australia, and India to reduce Beijing's control over strategic flows of goods and materials. The war is already happening, and it's not about tariffs, it's about power. Now the US is on the attack. Let's see if China will respond aggressively or wait for the next US election to continue its soft war.